Hello, everyone. A very good evening to you all. I'm Razia Iqbal, and I am delighted to be presenting this event, which is part of Selfridges Project Earth initiative. It's a journey the store has embarked on, which puts sustainability at the heart of its business and which aims to change the way we shop by 2025. That's not so long from now. The event is co-hosted by Intelligence Squared, the world's leading forum for live debate and discussion. I'm very glad that you are all with us tonight. We're going to be focusing on food and what we should all be doing to become more ethical eaters. The food industry is a major source of greenhouse gas emissions, contributing 23% of the global total. And meat and dairy products are among the worst of culprits. So, should we all go vegan? There might be some on the panel who will argue absolutely yes. And what else can we do to make sure that we are doing the right thing generally? Of course, the problem doesn't just lie with us, the consumers. Farms, factories, and retail all play their part too. And so we're going to be exploring the complex systems. That's what we're going to be exploring behind food supply. And we're going to find out what needs to be done at every single level to make sure that we meet our emissions targets, prevent biodiversity loss, and ensure a safe future for us all. So on the panel tonight, for what I hope is going to be a very interesting discussion, we have George Monbiot, one of the UK's best-known environmental campaigners. He has a regular column on the Guardian newspaper. He's written several books, best-selling books on the environment and on our political system and on rewilding Britain. I'm sure that's going to come up this evening. And in early 2020, I'm sure that some of you have seen this. He fronted the Channel 4 film Apocalypse Cow. And if you haven't, it is well worth watching, in which he argued that the biggest problem driving us towards global disaster is how we feed ourselves, particularly on meat. And he presented a radical vision for the future of food, which we will also discuss tonight. He's currently writing a book on this subject. Dr. Emma Keller, very warm welcome to you, head of the food team at WWF UK. WWF is, of course, the world's leading independent conservation organisation, and they are seeking to drive change in the food system and tackle some of the most urgent threats on nature and planetary health. And their goal is to help reconnect us all with our food in order to build a future of healthy people as well as a healthy planet. And last but not least, Mr. Lion, also known as Ryan Chettiawadena, award-winning bartender and entrepreneur who has championed a resource-conscious approach to cocktails. Yes, you heard me correctly. Cocktails focusing on sustainability without compromising on fun. He opened his first bar, White Lion, in London in 2013 as the first cocktail bar in the world to use no perishables, no fruit, and even no ice. I want to try one of your cocktails, Ryan. Welcome to you all. Okay, let's start by just quickly mentioning that we're going to be taking questions in a little bit later. So you can start submitting them now in the question box on your screen. Do start thinking about what you want to ask, but perhaps it will be prompted by what you're about to hear. Let's start by asking each of you to tell us briefly what kind of diet you follow. Really brief, quick question. Emma, let's start with you.
Thank you, Azzy. I am a flexitarian, but an environmentally conscious one at that. So the decisions for me that guide most of my choices for diet are those that are environmentally sustainable.
Okay, Ryan, what about you?
I'm about 90% plant-based. So I primarily source everything from similar fashion kind of producers and kind of growers that we can really support. But I do include little bits of dairy, and I can't quite give up honey. So there's little bits of animal products that sneak in.
Okay, thank you for being so honest. George, what about you?
Well, I'm plant-based, except that I eat roadkill, squirrels, and occasionally a piece of venison. So I've tried to match my diet as closely to environmental aims as I possibly can.
Okay, thank you for sharing that with us. Let's start by outlining the problem. And I think, Emma, let's go to you. Let's talk about what it is that we are faced with as a not just in this country, but as a planet, as a species. Nature is in free fall. We've lost 60% of our global species population. That is so profoundly serious and depressing.
Absolutely. So, in short, our food system is broken. If any of us were to take a pen and paper today and try and draw an ideal global food system, we would certainly not draw the one we have today. How we're eating is not good for us nor for the planet. And at least a third of us globally are eating way too much, and a third of us are eating too little. That's huge malnourishment on both sides of it. And at the same time, we're wreaking havoc on the planet and the very systems and resources in which we need to grow food, to have clean air, clean water. You've just mentioned one of my killer stats there, Azia, about exactly that. Last month, we published a huge piece of science called the Living Planet Report, which does a health check in what state our planet is in. And it showed that we've lost 68% of species populations around the world since 1970. That's just 50 years of time that nature has just been declining. And most importantly, the single biggest driver of that loss is our food system, the way we produce and consume our food. So there's no doubt things need to change, and they need to change urgently.
George, let's hear from you now. Just talk us through the converging forces that are bearing down on agriculture and the impact that it's making on the planet.
So the first issue is the sheer area of land that it uses. It's because of our agricultural sprawl that we've destroyed so many habitats and wiped out so many species. We talk about urban sprawl a lot, but if you take the case of the UK, urban areas, including all our parks, gardens, roads, airports, everything, occupy about 7% of our land. Farming occupies 70% of our land. And so it has a much bigger overall ecological impact. So it's a sheer area. At sea, of course, we see a very similar impact where basically the entire continental shelf is trawled just about every year, which means that nothing can grow there, nothing can live there, the fish species are wiped out. Then on top of that, you've got the impacts going on within these places. So you've got the soil erosion, you've got the wipeout of pollinators, so absolutely crucial for our food supply, the bees and the hoverflies and the beetles. You have the loss of water, irrigation water, absolutely crucial. And yet aquifers are drying up all over the place, and we're beginning to see major tensions about who gets the water, who gets to dam the rivers, who gets to suck the aquifer dry, which are only going to accelerate. And then we got the climate impacts as well. And scientists are beginning to talk about what they call multiple breadbasket failures, which is a terrifying idea that basically you could get the same global impact hitting the crucial global breadbaskets all at the same time and knocking out our major food supplies. And when I look at, you put all that together, and you sort of think of its synergistic effects of sort of how these things might exacerbate each other. And you think, right, I imagine that global leaders, this is their number one priority. They're all over this like a rash. Not a bit of it. It's as if these issues don't exist. They're sort of too far beyond the usual political time horizon. So it's absolutely terrifying that we're not engaging with them effectively.
Okay, before we explore why we're not engaging and how not just politicians but policymakers, but also us, we as consumers, how we should be engaging, let's stay with you, George, and just outline for us what form of agriculture is doing the most harm. And I'm thinking, of course, of Apocalypse Cow and the arguments that you put forward, which have been around for some time, but they are stark when you presented them in that film.
Well, by far, the overwhelming impact is livestock, because it occupies so much of the world's surface. 82% of the area is given over to livestock production, primarily for grazing, and yet it produces just a very small proportion of our food. It's an incredibly wasteful, profligate use of our land. And there's really two ways of producing livestock. One is grazing, sheep and cattle out on the ranges, and the other is growing grain and feeding that to livestock living indoors. And they're both tremendously harmful. But we live under the illusion that it's okay to go with the grazing stuff. So let's stop eating intensively produced grain-fed meat and we go for grazing instead. Actually, in some ways, it's much worse because it occupies so much more land. You've got these three converging issues. One of them is the sheer land take. One is the carbon opportunity cost, what you could be doing with that land if you weren't keeping animals on it. And the third is the ecological opportunity cost, all the wild animals and wild habitats that could be living there if you weren't using it to keep cattle and sheep. You put all those together and you see that in some respects it's even worse to eat pasture-fed meat and lamb than it is to eat intensively produced chicken and pork in a horrible captive situation where they're being pumped full of maize and soya.
Emma, let's look at that issue that George is alluding to, the loss in biodiversity, which is something that you're particularly interested in. Just outline for us the outcomes of that for us in the medium to long term future.
Absolutely. Well, yeah, biodiversity is what nature requires in order to produce the services, the functions, the materials, the resources, the food that we need to survive. And as soon as we start knocking out different species groups, we upset that entire balance of that system, which then, like George said, the pollinators going. We've now got crazy things happening in the world where we're having to ship bees from one part of the world to another to do a service that nature did for us for free. It's absolutely crazy. We've actually just produced a study earlier this year that looked at the global economic costs, and it's way bigger than the pandemic is going to cost us. So like George says, why isn't this on the top of our political leaders? In fact, next year is a massive opportunity. There's a global food summit where leaders will be gathering to look at the state of the world, the state of our food production systems. And if this pandemic hasn't done anything to wake them up, I honestly don't know what will. So absolutely, biodiversity's got to be critical. We've got to bring it more front and center. And it's not just nature for nature's sake and these wonderful species. It's about nature for us, for the very web of life that humans depend on.
Ryan, you're an entrepreneur. You talked about yourself being someone who is 90% plant-based in your own personal life. To what extent have you been aware of all of what we've just been hearing in terms of how that informed what you chose to do?
Well, it's probably a balance of points. So partly as a biologist, I identify with these points very, very keenly. And it's things that are it should seem obvious, and particularly those who are in charge of our systems, it's pretty glaring. And then I suppose the other side is always been trying to find ways to, as an educator, connect people with these topics. And I think a big part that I've tried to explore over the years of looking at the conversation from different angles is trying to find the ways to cut through, because the facts, the glaring obviousness of it that might seem the case is not always the right way to communicate it. So I think a lot of the work around kind of how to educate and how to find the right ways to connect people in an emotional sense to these topics has been a big motivator around our work, and how to, I suppose, frame some of the conversation for people.
Well, let's talk about that then, because we could get completely mired in why the politicians are not looking at these statistics and doing things about it. Let's look at what possible solutions there are from an individual perspective. Is it about personal diet? Is that a big thing that all of us can do? But both Emma and George, I'd like you to just engage with this a little bit. Do we all just need to eat less meat and vegetable and dairy, or do we just need to make a decision and completely cut those things out of our diet? George, you first, since you've chosen to do that.
Yeah, I mean, we should do everything we can individually to change our own diets, yes, but we've got to remember at the same time that these are political decisions too. There would be no livestock farming in this country at all if it weren't for farm subsidies. It's entirely propped up by public money. You look at the 4 million hectares or so occupied by sheep in this country. I mean, if an alien turned up in Britain, they would think that the dominant life form was sheep. The sheep were in charge because they've got so much of the land. All that land, which produces 1% of our food, and yet it covers an area roughly the same size as all our arable land, more than twice the area of all our urban land, just for sheep in the uplands is only happening, that massive environmental destruction, because we are paying for it. So as well as making personal decisions, which, and crudely speaking, broadly speaking, basically switching to a plant-based diet or almost entirely a plant-based diet is the best thing you can do. We also need to drive political decisions to actually change some of the completely irrational, bonkers uses of our own money, which are driving us towards environmental destruction.
Emma, in your view, is there a kind of approach that collectively that industry, the agricultural industry, can take? Is there a kind of animal husbandry that is acceptable, that should and could take us in a different direction, or is it really a question of engaging politicians in a way that will make them shift the way in which we eat, which is a much, much bigger ask, obviously?
It is, of course, and I think we've got three levels we need to engage on. Absolutely, we need our politicians to set nature laws that make sure we're enshrining high standards in law. We know that's particularly important for the UK as we prepare to exit the EU and we're going to renegotiate trade deals. We absolutely cannot have trade deals that would undermine the way we produce food, the types of food we should be eating. So definitely politicians, we know, is key. The second, of course, is businesses. Companies can do a huge amount to take that choice away from us. So companies can tackle issues like deforestation on our behalf and make sure that when we're shopping, we're not having to choose between a product containing deforestation and one without. They need to take responsibility for those big issues. But of course, we've all got agency.
Let's talk specifically then, because you are talking about deforestation. So let's talk about palm oil. Is that the kind of thing that you're talking about?
It is, yes. And I think George made the point earlier that as well as all the land that's occupied by our livestock, actually a huge amount of land is occupied by monoculture crops that are used to feed that livestock. So it's a double punch in the face of our livestock system. One of the most awful stats for me is that if we were to have a giant set of scales and put all the living creatures on Earth on those scales, 96% of the weight would be humans and the livestock that we use to feed ourselves. Just 4%, and that includes all the teeny tiny bugs as well as the big elephants and giraffes. Just 4% is our wild biomass, our wild nature. That's just a bonkers system. So, and that's what needs to change. And I think then the key thing, of course, is agency. We've all got agency to make choices. So if I was going to say anything to people, it would be start asking questions. Ask questions of your politicians, your MPs. Ask questions of your supermarkets, your restaurants. Where is the food coming from? How has it been produced? And what are they doing to make it better?
George, you wanted to come in there?
Yeah, I was just going to add to Emma's point that, it's not just this crazy number and weight of livestock, it's the growth rate as well. I mean, people go on and say, oh, look, the human population, it's rising unsustainably. But human population growth rate is roughly 1% a year, and it's leveling off very fast. Livestock population growth rate is 2.4% a year. It's more than twice that of the human population. And that's the real population crisis, because those livestock require vast areas of land, huge amount of resources to support them, and they're driving out wild habitats and wildlife and people across huge tracts of the land.
Ryan, when you first started to think about the kinds of businesses that you wanted to run, what was going through your mind in terms of being able to persuade people to do that simple and actually quite profoundly difficult thing, which is change their mindset? Changing cultures, changing habits is a really, really difficult thing. It's easy to talk about, but very, very hard to do. What were you thinking that you might be able to do to persuade people?
Well, I think one aspect of it was almost a language aspect. It was a branding part. It was showing the idea. It was dispelling some of the myths. The idea that sustainability meant that it was a total overhaul of your whole life, and it was something that was going to challenge every point at which you turn the corner. And I think one of the big points that we wanted to do was help dispel those myths and show that it wasn't an antithesis to the idea of something that was delicious or luxury or felt special and was something you could gather with your friends on. And the idea that that's such a universal thing that we all partake in was, trying to kick off a discussion and show that there was an opportunity for there being, I suppose, a balance of those two ideas. So I think a big motivation for it was to, I suppose, push people into having some of those different discussions, engage them in the conversation. To Emma's point about, getting them to ask their own questions as well. Partly that was, what don't you understand around like the balance that needs to happen here, but also encouraging them to go out when they go to other places, be it to their suppliers for the food that they buy for their homes or other restaurants and bars, to ask questions to show that this is a topic that involved everybody and was front of mind. It wasn't something that you only did in when you were buying some things in your home. It was to really pull that conversation into the public sphere. And I think a big part of everything we've tried to do in different venues and different conversations around the world is to show that those discussions need to be had on all of those levels.
Emma, what do you think about this idea of people trying to persuade people that they're not being denied something that they love, particularly when it comes to the habit of eating meat?
Definitely, and it's 2020. We're all full to the brim with bad news and the world's in peril. So I think what Ryan's doing to make this fun and accessible and engaging is really key. And that's exactly what we want people to do. With sustainability, it doesn't need a mass overhaul of your life. It's taking those steps one by one that are right for you, and absolutely starting to just moderate your meat. You don't need to cut out meat entirely, but start to moderate it. Look at making meat as a treat. Have it less times a week. Eat more plants. Make other steps in your life that make it much more accessible and easy to do, that are right for you and right for your family. We've actually just launched a new tool called planet-based diets. So not plant-based diets, but planet-based, which show basically that this needs to be flexible. Because actually, when you look at different countries in the world, you need a very different approach. In Denmark, for example, their biggest impact on biodiversity and nature loss is through their consumption of coffee and tea and spices that they import from really precious places in the world, not necessarily their meat. So, which is a very different story to us in the UK. So it really is about look at what's right for your context, your tradition, your culture, and take steps that you can as quickly as you can.
George, you've been an environmental campaigner from when you were a child. I wonder what you would say to people who are resistant to change, because although on the one hand you can bombard them with statistics and talk to them about the planet being in peril, the bottom line is that we are actually all quite selfish beings and we're stuck in our ways, So what do you say to people?
Well, we're constantly told we're selfish beings, but when you actually look at the psychological research, you find that while we've all got some selfishness and greed in us, and I certainly include myself in that, actually those aren't our dominant characteristics. We are primarily altruistic, empathetic, community-minded, family-minded, kind towards other people. We imagine that everybody is evil and out to get us, but actually we aren't like that, so why is everybody else like that? And I think when we begin to recognize that in each other, we begin to recognize it more in ourselves. And if we are constantly told, you're just here on earth to fight like stray dogs over a dustbin, that's how we're going to behave. But if we're told we're fundamentally good people, it's just that the systems we're in suppress that good nature and make us behave in selfish and greedy ways, then, and this applies, to everything, not just to food, then we tend to start behaving in better ways. And I think we just sort of need to keep reinforcing this message. And actually, we do care. We do care about other people, but we're constantly being told we don't care, we shouldn't care, we should just pursue our own interests. I mean, that's the whole neoliberal story, isn't it? Greed is good. The invisible hand of the market will deliver everything we want. We got rid of God and we invented the invisible hand of the market instead. And so just pursue your own interests. And actually, I think most people don't want to do that. But we almost need permission to be the good people that we are.
Talk us through, George, the possibilities in science research and development that's taking place now that could, in fact, persuade those policymakers and politicians that they don't have to be frightened of saying we can change the way we do agriculture?
Well, this is potentially really exciting. I think I would divide farming into three really distinct categories. One is fruit and veg, which has to be grown. The other is grain, which has to be grown. But the third one is protein and fats. And actually, these occupy by far the biggest land area at the moment. And those are the ones which could be produced by completely different means. And so there's enormous potential here to retire land from farming, to rewild it, to draw down carbon. And these different means basically involve producing microbial protein through fermentation, with various kinds of microbes are being experimented with at the moment, soil bacteria, fungi. I'm very excited by some of the soil bacteria, particularly the hydrogen oxygenating bacteria, because they don't need any feedstock except hydrogen and carbon dioxide. You don't need to be feeding them on flour or something like that to get them going. And so they're potentially very low impact. You just need the electricity to electrolyze the hydrogen, and that can be produced by green means. And last year I went to Helsinki and was the first person in the world outside the laboratory to eat a pancake made out of bacterial protein. And it tasted just like a pancake. It's fantastic. So there's enormous potential here. And you can then start feeding that microbial protein and microbial fat into other processes where you can start making palm oil without palm oil plantations. You can start making milk, you can start making meat, you can start making eggs, you can start making fish, potentially taking enormous pressure off the natural world. Now, I think we all know that the great majority of people are not going to go plant-based within the next 10 or 20 years, much as we would like them to do so. Obviously, I'm trying to encourage as many people to do that as they possibly can. But the race now is on to produce the meat and milk and fish that people are eating without inflicting this massive environmental damage, to do it in the factory, not in the field. And that, I think, is going to potentially have a really massive positive environmental impact.
Ryan, how excited are you by just hearing this, as a biologist, but also as an entrepreneur, as someone who could actually galvanize some of this stuff?
It's amazing. I mean, we've tried to, I suppose, blur those boundaries of food and drink over the years for this exact motivation. And about 10 years ago, we did some work on insect protein. And again, this is a topic we're discussing ethics here, and it starts to kind of stray into kind of that area for looking at insect protein. But what was really exciting was working with material scientists or with food scientists or people who have just been even some of the traditional world of fermentation, and looking at how we can use these techniques to transform the materials that are abundant, things that we can use in this kind of manner. There is this myth that we can't feed the world, and we know we need to scale up agriculture in this way, and we're being sold a lie. And the idea that it means that it's sacrifice and we're eating, I suppose that I see it often kind of proclaimed, the idea of this lab-grown meat and this Frankenstein meat and all these things, whereas actually it comes down to an education and a branding aspect. These are things that can be truly delicious. And actually, it's a very exciting thing for us as chefs and bartenders and people who work in all of the adjacent fields within food and drink, to show that these are just new parts of our palate. These are really exciting things for us to latch hold of and really create things that do exactly what we use food for. Yes, it's about kind of nourishing us and making sure that is a universal trait, and we're making sure that everybody in the world is looked after in this way. That's a duty that all of us have. But it's also about showing that that's part of our joy. It's something that is a very universal across cultures way of coming together. And if we can do things that use these materials that don't have this negative impact on the planet, and in fact are looking to do things that have a positive effect, then how does that not add to that joy? It's just an extra level on top of what we can do to kind of embrace the world of food and drink. It's incredibly exciting.
Emma, let's talk a little bit about the issue that Ryan just brought up. This myth about the being able to feed the world. You know, whatever George is saying about the population is in fact growing. We are going to have to be able to feed 10 billion people by 2050. What is it that you are looking at specifically that makes it possible for you to persuade those people in the developing world who want exactly the same things that we have had in the developed world for a very long time?
Yeah, because, well, we know our current food system is producing enough to feed us all, except that most of that is coming at the expense of the planet. So that's what we need to start to change. And we've been locked into a system that's just exacerbating some of this detriment, and that's what we need to break out of. And I think, if anything, COVID-19 has shown us that actually the systems are incredibly fragile. And if we've seen anything, it's that a problem in the food system somewhere, wherever this started, is a problem in the food system everywhere. And we've all experienced that in the last 7 to 8 months, and it's ongoing. So we're looking at a number of things, exactly like George has just mentioned, these exciting innovations. What do we need, where do we need to get to in 10 years? And then what's the transition to get there, which is getting people to eat less, also looking at things like insects and other novel proteins, etc. And it's making sure we don't export our bad production systems and economic cycles that we've got into here to other markets. And actually, we're going to have to face up to this as the developed world who've made the mistakes. I mean, in the UK, we talk about deforestation of palm oil in Malaysia or in Borneo. In truth, Borneo has 50% of its forest remaining. In the UK, we have less than 10% of our woodland ecosystem. We just happened to get there first. We cleared it all hundreds of years ago. So we will have to face up that if we want producer country nations to be able to develop economically, socially, we're going to have to pay for that because the globe cannot handle it. The best example to tackling climate change is if we stop losing our forests. Because if we lose the Amazon rainforest, we've truly lost the battle against irreversible climate change.
Just a quick reminder to everyone who has logged on, do start sending us your questions for anyone on the panel, even if it's about something that we haven't discussed yet. I'm sure they'll be very happy to answer anything that you bring forward. George, let's pick up on this point that Emma just made about not exporting the habits that we have acquired in the developed world, which of course are damaging the planet so much. But we have already, haven't we, to a large extent? I mean, there are lots of countries that emulate exactly what we have been doing in the developed world for some time.
But by and large, the richer people get, the more meat they eat. That's a fairly solid rule. And in Britain, US and Australia even more, we've really led the way on that. I mean, we eat, 2/3 of our body weight every year in meat. In this country, and I think it's 1.5 times in the US and in Australia. I mean, this is extraordinary gluttony, but unfortunately, it sets the sort of global standard. This is what other people think. Well, that's how you behave in a rich country. So as we become richer, that's what we want. And obviously, we're in no position to lecture anyone else while we're still eating like that. And so, the first step is to sort ourselves out, rather than just preaching to other people. We've got to sort our own practices out, which are terrible. If you look at if you look at our global footprint, Britain has an ecological footprint of roughly 5 hectares per person, and it has what's called a biological capacity of 1 hectare per person. So, in other words, we are grabbing 5 times as many resources as we produce in this country. And so our prosperity, particularly our diet, comes about at the expense of other parts of the world and therefore of other people. Now, if everybody lived like us, we would need 5 planets. So obviously, we don't have 5 planets. We can't continue on that trajectory. So we have massively to reduce our footprints. And in doing so, develop a new cuisine, which maybe other people might want to follow. Now, it will help enormously if we can take fat and protein out of the farming system, produce them by other means, much lower footprints, because I think people will continue to want to eat more fat and protein. But if we can do it by means which are far less cruel, and that's one thing we haven't talked about yet, the enormous cruelty of livestock farming, but also far less cruel to the planet, then that's in the long run going to be a benefit to everyone.
Well, let's talk about the cruelty aspect. I mean, both Ryan and Emma. I mean, is this an angle that we should be pursuing? Is to highlight how cruel these the way in which we produce food is to the animals in the system. Is that something that will only result in people feeling shamed or people feeling indifferent? Because the bottom line is to try and change people's attitudes. Ryan, what do you think?
I think your point about the shame is really important, because that's not a motivator for people. It's, it clamps people down, and I think it's really crucial that we, I think that's been a difficult part of the discussion for a long time, is kind of lecturing people and instilling the blame on the individual. But I think, it is a responsibility we have. I think in one sense you can educate people and say, yes, the deliciousness of what you consume is actually impacted by the livelihood of what you're consuming. And, if we encourage better welfare across the board, that is something that we can see the impact of. But I would hope is, and the difficulty is how to educate this, because as soon as you look into these systems, it's pretty glaring. I mean, the first research I did into animal welfare, when I was looking at the insect lectures I did, it was harrowing. It's very, very challenging to look at some of the the materials, and you hear about the experiences that happen, and the idea of that being inflicted on a living creature for our consumption is something I think that people would struggle with. But I think we need to find a way of highlighting that in a manner that doesn't, it doesn't become a very heavy topic for people. And that's the balance. It is a heavy topic, but we need to find a way of disseminating that information in a mass sense, because it's something that everybody should consider in the way that they're consuming.
Emma, did you want
We've
to come
learned
in
very
there?
much this. Yeah, just to say, yeah, we've learned exactly the same. That fear and scaring people it can make them wake up, but it doesn't motivate them to change. And we absolutely have to offer hope and agency and power to do that. And there's lots of different things out there. There's some amazing apps that we can all take shopping and scan products, and they'll tell us how healthy, sustainable, and ethical they are. And that helps give us agency, that we know if we walk into a particular retailer that they've taken care of it for us for the most part, and then we can make choices that we can make. So it's really got to be a hopeful message. And we know we've got 10 years to save the planet. 10 years sounds like a long time, but it's not. And I've been working with companies since 2010 who made bold promises to me by then that they would have stopped deforestation in 2020. Well, we're here, we're at that deadline, and still we're losing a football field of forest every 2 seconds. Clearly the problem has not been solved. So if we're to get serious about saving the planet, we really do need to act in these next 10 years. And we've got, what a unique moment in time. All governments around the world are looking at how do we build back better. Well, we certainly don't build a better system by fueling more consumption of what we've been eating, which actually drives us more into hospitals, puts more strain on our already strained healthcare systems. It's just a really bad negative, positive feedback loop of these bad things just leading on to more bad things. So we've really got to break that system.
George, I'm just going to put some questions to all of you now, because they're coming in thick and fast. Just picking up on the point that you made, Emma, about the opportunity that this current moment presents politicians with, it does strike me that they all seem very eager to go back to how it was rather than trying to do things better. But so let me ask George, for you to respond to this question from Joe. How can we realign sustainable environmental goals with short-term economic goals?
Well, as Emma says, we have this unprecedented opportunity. And it is insane that we're just being pushed back with huge expenditure of our money into the old system, Whereas, the opportunity to have a Green New Deal based not on sort of trying to just get economic activity back up to what it was, but based on trying to reset the whole way in which we live economically on the planet. That opportunity is right here. When the US entered the Second World War, it turned its economy around on a dime. The civilian manufacturing plants went over to military manufacturing within a couple of months. Within a couple of months, they were turning out fighter jets when they'd never made a fighter jet before. They were turning out not jets, planes. They were turning out amphibious vehicles. They were turning out missiles, all the rest of it. It turned the whole thing around. This was before the era of digitization. We could do the same. We could do it in weeks, literally in weeks. We could emerge into a different economy if we chose to. This is a political choice. And the problem we're up against is vested interests, the power of sunk costs. So people have invested money in the existing system, in the meat packing plants, in the hog farms, whatever it might be, and they want to recoup that money and they want to carry on doing what they're doing. And governments are pouring money into the old economy to allow them to carry on. Instead, they should be bailing them out into a different economy and into saying, okay, you've got this massive industrial plant here, let's use it to produce microbial protein instead. The opportunity is right within our grasp. And unfortunately, the lobbyists, the power of the lobbyists at the moment is overwhelming the power of democracy. We, the people, have to reassert our power.
So there's been lots of questions around whether we should be investing in innovations, which is something that you've just alluded to, innovations to improve the alternative options, which you've kind of answered, George. Another question here, Emma, perhaps we can start with you on this one. The impact on food standards and animal welfare via the UK and US potential trade deal. We don't know whether we're going to get one. How can we influence Parliament?
We can all write to our MPs and say that this matters. You might have all seen there's a petition, there's many petitions at the moment, but there's one that Jamie Oliver's championing, which is around upholding high environmental standards. I mean, we only have to look at the US health system and the US food system and say, do we want to import that food into the UK? I think not. And of course, we depend on a national health service. In the US, that's privatized. So there's different strains. I don't think we want to be importing chlorinated chicken or hormone injected beef or other things that are being produced poorly into the UK. So it's absolutely critical. So the more voices that are heard saying uphold high environmental standards, use this opportunity to reform our subsidies, make food production better for us, for everybody, I think is absolutely key. And the government are listening. They're listening to the people, if anything. They're not necessarily always listening to businesses, but they're certainly listening to us. So we've all got a voice we can use.
George, this one is an obvious one for you, since you are also part of the media. How can the media facilitate behavioural change across the food system and for consumers? What are the tools or resources that food media would need in order to deliver a more robust reporting in the context of sustainability?
Well, first of all, don't rely on the media, because the media is completely corrupt. I mean, the great majority of it is owned by billionaires, and what they want to do is to pursue their interests, the interests of the special class to which they belong. And they're not operating in the interests of most of humanity. Quite the opposite. In fact, there's a very interesting analysis by the Canadian professor of social science, Kevin Mackay, who shows that societies that collapse are those which are unduly governed by oligarchs. So across the history of humanity, when there's been a massive civilizational collapse, it's because there's a tiny number of people making all the decisions, and those decisions are often against the interests of humanity as a whole. Well, that's where we are. The billionaires have far too much power. So don't rely on the billionaire media to get us out of this. It's not going to. We have to use social media above all else. And there's tremendous potential now in new video companies and in new ways of basically using platforms, admittedly, which are owned by billionaires, but using them against the billionaire interest.
Ryan, what do you think? What kinds of avenues and platforms should people be looking at to exploit?
I mean, it's again, it's those true forms of education, and I think there's a lot that can be done to, we live in an age where we have more access to information than ever before. The irony is that we're not listening to that, and it's plummeting us towards a slightly more hairy situation. But I think we need to be able to use these forms of communication. Being able to go to talks such as this, which have an open forum, that have an ability to share information. Social media has been an incredible boom in an ability to disseminate that as well. So I think it is crucial that we ask those questions again. It goes back to that point. The idea that the economy is suffering as a result of these changes is when you start to dig just beneath the surface, it shows that it's not true. The creative industries, the way of tackling these problems, isn't against the economy. It's quite the opposite. It actually opens up new avenues. So I think the idea of seeking out the facts and doing the fact checking, and there is so much misinformation out there at the moment. The internet is humankind's greatest invention, but it's at the same time there is so much misinformation out there, and being able to take that time, ask the questions, be able to connect to those sources. And again, the beauty of the internet is you can ask questions, you can go to experts, and they're willing to share some of this, their hardworking passion on these topics, and being able to share that within your own network. We all live in our own slight bubble of things. The more that you're able to find out, ask questions, and share, the more that we can turn the tide on the fact that this really needs to be a topic that involves everyone. It's not just for the niche of us.
Emma, people have been listening very carefully. So could you name some of the apps that you have mentioned on just the ones that you mentioned in terms of helping consumers and giving them agency?
Definitely. There's a great app called Geeky, Giki, where you can scan the barcode of products in all your supermarkets, and it will give you a series of badges as to how well they perform. There's one we've just launched, actually, WWF, called My Footprint, that you can again download on your phone, and you can put in your different lifestyle habits and see what impact that's having on the planet and how you can make small changes. And I see there's a question there on what would be the one key thing everybody could do to make a positive change. I think we'd all say it's quite clear from this that moderating your meat or moving to a plant-based diet would be absolutely key. But in the words of David Attenborough, who's recently done a new film, A Life on Our Planet, which is about his amazing 94 years on our planet, seeing probably the man in the world that's seen the most amount of nature and the most destruction. His key message to us all is don't waste. Don't waste food. Don't waste energy, and absolutely do not waste time. We have this 10 years ahead of us to fix these problems. We cannot waste that time anymore.
So let's turn to the other two then, Ryan and George. What would be the single thing that you? I mean, I'm assuming you'll endorse what Emma's just said, but the single thing that you would say to people.
I mean, I think it's really crucial to not be paralyzed by this topic. It can be quite scary, and I think there's everybody's trying to. A lot of people, I think, to George's point before, people do care. It is part of our nature to feel invested in the people that surround us. And I think the idea that we're being blamed or being bombarded by some of these things can push people to the point of paralysis. And I think it's really important to understand that you do have agency, you do have a role, and it's not about you. It's about how you fit in the whole. But every little helps. Being able to overcome those little steps. There's all these myths around how hard it is, how expensive it's going to be, how much of a sacrifice to your whole existence this can be. But actually being able to participate and get started. I suppose it is reiterating that point on not wasting time. But it is about looking at the problems that you can, that face you. It's different for where you are in the world, what position you are in your society. You have an ability to create an impact. And even if that's talking to the people around you, it's hugely beneficial. It's not wasted. So I think it's I suppose a rallying call to say that this is an opportunity for everybody to really make a difference. And we all have our part to play, but it's something that we can all make a major impact in.
George.
I think it's also, I mean, I completely agree with everything Ryan says, but I think it's also worth pointing out that some people do have a lot more choice in this than others. I was at a food bank this morning in a place which is ranks among the highest places in Britain on the Child Poverty Index, and seeing people come up and receive their food, chatting with them, and over their shoulders I could see these £3 million houses just on the other side of the playing field. And it was just such a sort of picture of modern Britain. This is the way we've gone. It's so outrageous. These are people who would literally be starving if it weren't for the food bank. And yet here they were in the midst of unbelievable affluence. And so, if we're going to sort this out, we have to do it in an equitable and socially just way. This is absolutely essential that everybody gets to eat good food. But if everybody's going to get to eat good food, and I mean that globally, not just nationally, then those who are eating too much of something, particularly meat and fish, we just have to eat a lot less, just have to massively reduce our impacts if other people are going to improve their diets. And we must hope that technology is going to help us, but it's not here yet. So the key thing is, as much as we possibly can, in the next 10 years or so, while we're waiting for these new technologies to turn up, is really to try to lower our footprint. And that primarily means plant-based, moving away from animal products, but there also are some plants which are really bad. So almonds, are really bad news environmentally. Avocados tend to be really bad news. Asparagus from Peru is really bad news. It's complicated. As Ryan says, we mustn't get overwhelmed by the complexities. But by and large, plants are better than animals, with those few exceptions.
Emma, just you were talking about the list of things that David Attenborough says we shouldn't do, and not wasting time is one of them. But let's just focus on the issue of waste, since we do waste so much food. What is it that you think that people can do individually, but also in terms of organizations and governments? Are there systems that already exist that work, for instance?
Yeah, food waste is a really interesting one. If food waste was a country, it would be the third biggest greenhouse gas emitter, for the third biggest contributor to climate change in the world. It's huge. We are just such a wasteful species. So we can tackle that at so many levels. I think we've all got closer to our food bins recently during lockdown, as we've been eating nearly all of our food at home. We see how much goes in the waste. And I think actually we've all been able to make better habits because we know now what we've got. We're not out and about as much. So let's start getting a handle on our own food waste and really looking at what goes into our food waste bins. And then retail. There's a huge amount that gets wasted at retail, which fortunately throughout the pandemic and just before, companies were getting better at dedicating it to food banks and giving it away, because the last thing they want to be doing is just throwing food in the bin. But the biggest unknown and the most unspoken about bit is how much food doesn't even make it to our plate. It just gets left in the field. And part of that is because we're all used to wanting or demanding perfect products, the perfectly shaped banana, the perfectly shaped carrot. And so those wonky things that have grown around a stone or aren't quite perfectly formed are just left to rot in huge piles in the field. And that's just a massive tragedy. So if we can that's a big area that the government can help us with, that companies can help us with, that we can change mindsets, make it fun, like lots of work Ryan's doing. How do we make wonky fruit, ugly fruit and veg more fun, more engaging? And of course, we can grow more at home is another key thing we can do around food waste.
George, you wanted to say something?
Yeah, so not all food waste is equally amenable. There's some parts of the food chain where you can make a big difference. There's others, like within the processing chain, within factories, where it's very hard to intervene. It's also worth pointing out that dealing with food waste in countries like our own, rich countries, is relatively easy. But if in much poorer countries, to massively reduce the amount of food being wasted, you're going to need more roads, more refrigeration, more plastic packaging. So you have all sorts of other waste coming in order to reduce your food waste. So we just had to be a bit careful about overemphasizing food waste. And I think if David Attenborough did, he got a lot right in that program, but I think there was a bit too much emphasis on that, as this is going to be our salvation. I mean, he's come on very nicely in the last couple of years, and I think he'll go far. But I think he was pressing that button a bit too hard for my tastes.
We have only got a few minutes left, and quite a lot of what we've been talking about has been extraordinarily challenging, and you've all tried very hard to talk about it in a way that makes us all as individuals feel that we have agency and the power to do something, which tells me that fundamentally you're all actually quite optimistic, even though in the face of unbelievable challenges you're still able to be optimistic. So this is a question from Abby, really, which I'd like to end with for each of you, just to outline how optimistic you are about the challenges going forward in say the next 10 years. Since Emma, you talked about how we have 10 years to save the planet. So let's start with you. How optimistic are you?
I don't think I could do my job if I wasn't an optimist. And I'm faced with negative stories and doom and gloom all the time, but I do see glimmers of hope. And I've said it already, but I think this is the unique moment where we're going to do it. We have the solutions. We know what needs to be done. It's really now about the political will. So I'm really optimistic that next year there are some key events, the food summit in the middle of the year, but also the climate change event, which has actually been hosted in the UK, in Glasgow in November, where world leaders have got to come together and actually commit and ratify what they committed to in 2015, that a world of 1.5 degrees. One major thing that no nation on earth has done yet as part of their contribution to how they're going to tackle climate change. Not a single nation has included diets in how they're going to address climate change. So one major thing we could see going forward is that countries will start to say, this is what changing our nation's diet will also do to tackle climate change. And I'm really seeing some great political leadership around the world. Of course, we know there are other places where it lacks, but I think, there's a really key moment. So I'm highly optimistic.
Ryan, where are you on the grid of optimism?
I mean, I think I'm always an optimist, but I think particularly in this topic, I feel both excited and very optimistic about it. I think there is, I think as soon as people connect with nature, they have this kind of childlike wonder about it, and I feel like that's starting to really spread in a universal way. And amazing things like David Attenborough on a major platform being able to talk about these things, it's connecting people to it. And we talked a bit about before about waste and where that plays a role. And, it's almost about going back to when we were at school and learning about deforestation and desertification and the fact that waste is the final part of the stage. I think people are starting to move beyond that as a topic, and they're realizing both the scale and the where they need to get involved in this topic, but how interconnected it all is, their love of nature and their ability to go out to their park with their children or whatever it is. I think people are very universally realizing the gravity of the situation. And I think that is the opportunity to turn the tide on it. I think, in the past, there was a lot of passionate people who'd been plugging away at this. And I think we all realized that, it wasn't about hitting people over the head with the facts. It was about finding ways to connect people to it. And I think just that realization of the fragility of nature and how wonderful everything that we've grown up with was something to experience, and the fact that it's a true travesty if that was to be let go. I think I feel like it's become something that involves everybody, and I feel very optimistic about us being able to get on top of it.
George, in a very short space of time, tell us how optimistic you are. The last word with you.
Well, what we're up against here is what we're up against on every topic, which is the power of money, the power of billionaires, the power of industrial lobbyists. These are the people we've got to confront, and we need to reassert our democratic power. And we're seeing this with Fridays for Future, with Extinction Rebellion, with movements like this, particularly among young people around the world. They give me hope.
George Monbiot, Dr. Emma Keller, and Mr. Lion, Ryan Chettiar-Wardena. Thank you all very much indeed. So much food for thought. And thank you to Selfridges and to Intelligence Squared. And a very good evening to everyone. Thanks. Bye-bye.